The drill instructor's voice cut through the humid morning air at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island, like a knife through butter. What the hell is that supposed to be, recruit? 52-year-old Margaret Chun stood at attention, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in regulation style, sweat already beading on her forehead despite the early hour. Around her, teenagers and 20-somethings tried to suppress their snickers as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez circled her like a predator sizing up. Pray, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ma'am, this recruit is attempting to execute the proper push-up position as instructed, sir. Margaret's voice rang out clear and strong, though her arms trembled slightly under the strain. What none of them knew, not the cocky kids who'd already dubbed her Grandma, not the drill instructors who saw her as a liability, not even Margaret herself, was that in just 3 months, she would shatter every marksmanship record at Paris Island and rewrite the book on what it means to be a Marine. Margaret Chun had never imagined she'd be lying face down in South Carolina sand at 52 years old. But life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. 3 months earlier, she'd been a suburban mom in Portland, Oregon, working as a high school chemistry teacher and looking forward to early retirement. Then her son Jake came home from his second deployment in Afghanistan and couldn't look her in the eye. The nightmares started immediately. Jake would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, calling out names of buddies who hadn't made it home. Margaret would find him sitting in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing, his hands shaking as he tried to drink coffee. When she asked what was wrong, he'd just shake his head and say, "You wouldn't understand, Mom. You weren't there." That phrase, "you weren't there," burned in Margaret's chest like acid. She'd raised Jake alone after his father died in a car accident when the boy was 8. She'd worked double shifts to put him through school, then there for every scraped knee and broken heart. But she hadn't been there for the only thing that seemed to matter now, the crucible that had forged her son into someone she barely recognized. The idea first came to her on a Tuesday morning in February. She was grading papers when the news reported on a 50-year-old woman who'd joined the Army National Guard. Margaret stared at the television, watching this stranger in uniform talk about serving her country. And something clicked. If she could survive 25 years of teaching high school chemistry to hormonal teenagers, surely she could handle basic training. The Marine Corps recruiter in downtown Portland looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Staff Sergeant Williams was probably younger than some of her students, all buzz-cut and pressed uniform, and he clearly didn't know what to make of the middle-aged woman sitting across from his desk asking about enlistment. "Ma'am, are you sure you've thought this through?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Basic training is intense. Most recruits are 18 to 25 years old." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I've spent my entire adult life dealing with teenagers who think they know everything. I've broken up fights, mediated disputes, and maintained order in classrooms with 30 kids hopped up on energy drinks. I think I can handle a few drill instructors." Staff Sergeant Williams pulled out a thick packet of forms. "The physical requirements are no joke. You'll need to pass the initial strength test just to ship out, and that's before you even start the real training." Margaret took the papers without hesitation. "What's the IST?" 2 pull-ups, 44 crunches in 2 minutes, and a 1.5-mile run in under 15 minutes. He watched her face carefully. "For your age group, when can I take it?" That was the beginning of the longest 3 months of Margaret's life. She'd never been particularly athletic. Her idea of exercise was walking to the mailbox, but she threw herself into training with the same methodical approach she used to teach chemical equations. She bought a pull-up bar for her garage, started running at dawn before school, and spent her lunch breaks doing crunches in her empty classroom. The physical transformation was gradual but noticeable. Her soft middle firmed up, Her arms developed definition she'd never had even in her 20s, and her endurance improved week by week, but the real change was mental. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like she was doing something that mattered, something that might help her understand what Jake had been through. Her colleagues thought she'd lost her mind. The principal, Dr. Sarah Morrison, called her into the office after Margaret submitted her resignation letter. "Margaret, you've been here 15 years. You're one of our best teachers. Are you having some kind of midlife crisis?" Margaret had considered her response carefully. "My son came back from Afghanistan broken, and I don't know how to help him. Maybe if I understand what he went through, what made him who he is now, I can find a way to reach him." Dr. Morrison leaned back in her chair. "There are therapists for that. Support groups. You don't have to join the military. Jake won't go to therapy. He says civilians don't understand." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands were clenched in her lap. Maybe he's right. The hardest part was telling Jake. She found him in the garage on a Saturday afternoon, mindlessly taking apart and reassembling his motorcycle engine, a ritual he'd developed since coming home. His hands were steady with the tools, but she could see the slight tremor that came when he wasn't focused on something mechanical. "I'm joining the Marines," she said without preamble. Jake's head snapped up so fast she thought he might have hurt his neck. "What did you just say?" "I'm 52, which means I just make the age cutoff. I've been training for 3 months. I ship out to Paris Island in 2 weeks. The wrench in Jake's hand clattered to the concrete floor. "Mom, you can't be serious." "I am completely serious." Margaret pulled up a lawn chair and sat down across from him. "You keep telling me I don't understand what you went through. You're right, I don't. But maybe I can. Basic training isn't the same as combat deployment." Jake's voice was flat, controlled in a way that reminded her of his father. "You're not going to understand anything except how to make a bed and march in formation. Then I'll understand that much more than I do now." Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the far end of the garage. "You could get hurt. You could die. Do you have any idea what they put recruits through?" "Some idea." Margaret's voice was calm. "But I'm not going to change my mind." "Why?" The word came out strangled, desperate. "Why would you do this to yourself?" "To us?" Margaret looked at her son, this young man who'd been her whole world for so long, who'd come home from war as a stranger and tried to find words that would make him understand. "Because I'm losing you," she said quietly. "Every day you slip a little further away. You won't talk to me, you won't let me help, and I'm watching you disappear into whatever happened over there. If joining the Marines gives me even a chance of understanding what you're going through, then it's worth it." Jake was quiet for a long time, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally turned around, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They're going to eat you alive, Mom. You have no idea what you're getting into." "Maybe not," Margaret admitted. "But I'm going to find out." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of final preparations. Margaret closed her classroom for the last time, said goodbye to colleagues who still thought she'd lost her mind, and tried to memorize every detail of the house she'd called home for 20 years. Jake barely spoke to her, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. The night before she left, she found him sitting on the back porch, staring up at the stars. She sat down beside him without saying anything, the way she used to when he was little and troubled by something at school. "I had a buddy," Jake said suddenly. "Tommy Kowalski. Kid from Detroit. Tough as nails, reminded me of you in some ways. Always had something smart to say, never backed down from anything." Margaret waited, hardly daring to breathe. "He stepped on an IED 3 months into our deployment. Died before the medics could get to him." Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands were shaking. "I think about him every day. I think about all of them." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. The thing is, Mom, I don't think basic training is going to help you understand that. Some things you can't understand unless you've lived them. Margaret reached over and took his hand. Maybe you're right, but I have to try. Jake squeezed her fingers. You're either the bravest person I know or the craziest. Probably both. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Jake spoke again. Promise me something. Anything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to prove anything to anyone. Just ... come home, okay? Margaret smiled in the darkness. I promise. The flight to Charleston was surreal. Margaret sat between a nervous 18-year-old from Nebraska and a 23-year-old college graduate from Texas, both of whom kept glancing at her with barely concealed confusion. She'd gotten used to the stares over the past few months, but it still felt strange to be so obviously out of place. The bus ride to Paris Island was worse. 42 recruits crammed into a military transport vehicle, most of them young enough to be her children or even grandchildren. The kid next to her, who couldn't have been more than 19, kept stealing glances at her gray-streaked hair and the crow's feet around her eyes. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why are you here? Margaret turned to look at him. He had kind eyes and a soft southern accent, probably from somewhere in Georgia or Alabama. Same reason you are, I imagine, to serve my country. But you're... He trailed off, clearly struggling for a polite way to phrase it. Old enough to be your mother? Margaret smiled. Yes, I am. My name's Margaret Chun. What's yours? Billy Patterson, ma'am. From Mobile, Alabama. He stuck out his hand and she shook it. I just ... I've never seen anyone your age in basic training before. Well, Billy Patterson from Mobile, Alabama. I guess we're both going to learn something new. The bus pulled through the gates of Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island at sunset, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. The place looked exactly like what it was, a machine designed to break down civilians and rebuild them as Marines. Concrete buildings stretched in perfect rows, flags snapped in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of recruits being put through their paces. Listen up, maggots. The drill instructor who boarded their bus was everything Margaret had expected and worse. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was built like a brick wall, with arms that looked like they could crush a man's windpipe and a voice that could probably shatter glass. You have 30 seconds to get your sorry asses off my bus and onto those yellow footprints. Move! The next few minutes were chaos. Recruits stumbled over each other in their haste to follow orders. Bags flew everywhere. And the drill instructors screamed instructions that seemed designed to be impossible to follow. Margaret found herself standing on painted yellow footprints in the gathering dusk, surrounded by young faces that looked as terrified as she felt. Look around you, ladies. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the evening air. Some of you think you know what you're getting into. Some of you think you're tough. Some of you think you're special. His eyes swept the formation and landed on Margaret. And some of you are clearly confused about where you are. A few of the recruits snickered, and Margaret felt her face burn with embarrassment. But she kept her eyes forward and her mouth shut, the way she'd learned to do when dealing with difficult parents or hostile administrators. Let me make something clear, Rodriguez continued. I don't care if you're 18 or 80. I don't care if you're a high school dropout or a college graduate. I don't care if you're male or female. For the next 13 weeks, you are nothing but raw material, and my job is to turn you into Marines. Some of you will make it. Some of you will quit. Some of you will break, his gaze fixed on Margaret again. And some of you will realize you made a terrible mistake and go home to your grandchildren where you belong. Margaret felt something ignite in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when a student told her she was too old to understand modern technology, or when a parent suggested she was too soft to handle their difficult child. It was a feeling she'd learned to channel into determination rather than anger. "Sir, yes, sir," she shouted along with the rest of the formation, her voice carrying clearly in the humid air. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow but moved on. "Welcome to Paris Island, welcome." To hell. The first week was a blur of medical exams, paperwork, and initial processing. Margaret found herself assigned to Platoon 3021, 3rd Recruit Training Battalion. Her rack, military speak for bed, was in the middle of the squad bay, filled with bunks arranged in perfect rows, each one occupied by a recruit who looked young enough to be her child. The whispers started immediately. Grandma was the kindest thing they called her. She heard old lady, crazy woman, and worse when they thought she wasn't listening. But Margaret had dealt with worse from teenagers, who were supposed to respect her, so she learned to tune it out. The physical training was brutal. Margaret had thought she was in decent shape after 3 months of preparation, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of Marine Corps PT. Push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, and runs that seemed to go on forever. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned. And more than once she wondered if Jake had been right about her making a terrible mistake. But she didn't quit. When the 18-year-old in the rack next to her gave up on day 3 and requested to be sent home, Margaret was still there. When the tough-talking college graduate from Texas broke down crying during a particularly brutal workout, Margaret was still there. When half the platoon got sick from the stress and the unfamiliar food, Margaret was still there. The drill instructor seemed determined to break her first. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had a special talent for finding new ways to make her life miserable. If the platoon had to do 20 push-ups, Margaret had to do 25. If they had to run 2 miles, she had to run 3. If they had to stand at attention for an hour, she had to stand for an hour and 15 minutes. "What's the matter, Grandma?" Rodriguez would shout when she struggled. "Too old for this? Maybe you should have stayed home with your knitting." Margaret learned to bite her tongue and push through. She'd dealt with worse from school board members who wanted to cut her budget or parents who blamed her for their children's poor grades. At least drill instructors were honest about their hostility. The other recruits were a mixed bag. Some, like Billy Patterson, were genuinely kind and seemed to respect her for sticking it out. Others clearly resented her presence, seeing her as a liability that might get them all in trouble. A few seemed to view her as some kind of curiosity, a zoo animal to be observed and discussed. "Why are you really here?" asked David Kim, a 20-year-old from California, during one of their rare moments of free time. "And don't give me that 'serve my country' line. People your age don't just randomly decide to join the Marines." Margaret was folding her uniforms. With the precision they'd been taught, every crease perfect, every item in its designated place. "My son is a Marine. He came back from Afghanistan changed, and I wanted to understand what he went through." "So you decided to put yourself through hell to understand your kid?" David shook his head. "That's either really sweet or really stupid." "Maybe both," Margaret admitted, echoing the conversation she'd had with Jake weeks earlier. "Does he know you're here?" "Yes." Margaret's voice was quiet. "He thinks I'm crazy. He's probably right." David's tone wasn't unkind. "But I guess we're all crazy for being here." The weeks blurred together in a routine of physical training, classroom instruction, and drill practice. Margaret learned to march in formation, to clean her rifle until it gleamed, to make her bed so tight a quarter would bounce off it. She learned Marine Corps history, military law, and the warrior ethos that was supposed to transform her from a civilian into a Marine. But she also learned things they didn't teach in the classroom. She learned that her body was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. She learned that mental toughness was as important as physical strength. She learned that the young recruits who'd initially dismissed her were watching her with growing respect as she refused to quit, despite the extra punishment the drill instructors heaped on her. Most importantly, she learned that she was tougher than she'd ever given herself credit for. The turning point came during week 6, when they began weapons training. Margaret had never held a rifle before in her life, but she'd spent decades teaching physics and chemistry, subjects that required precision, patience, and attention to detail. When the marksmanship instructor, Staff Sergeant Williams, began explaining the fundamentals of shooting, Margaret listened with the same intensity she'd once brought to teaching molecular structures. "Shooting is a science," Staff Sergeant Williams explained to the assembled recruits. "It's about breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, and follow-through. It's about consistency, patience, and mental discipline. Anyone can learn to shoot well if they're willing to put in the work." Margaret thought about the hours she'd spent perfecting her teaching technique, the way she'd practiced explanations until they were flawless, the patience she'd developed working with students who struggled to understand complex concepts. Maybe this wouldn't be so different. The first day on the range was a disaster for most of the platoon. Recruits who'd talked tough about their hunting experience or video game skills found themselves unable to hit targets at even close range. The combination of adrenaline, pressure, and unfamiliar equipment left most of them frustrated and embarrassed. Margaret approached the firing line with the same methodical mindset she'd brought to everything else. She listened carefully to the instructor's guidance, controlled her breathing the way she'd learned to do during stressful parent conferences, and focused on the target with the same concentration she'd once brought to grading AP chemistry exams. Her first shot was a miss, but it was close. Her second shot was closer. By the end of the session, she was consistently hitting the target, while recruits half her age were still spraying bullets all over the range. "Not bad for a first-timer, Staff," Sergeant Williams commented as he reviewed her target. "You've got potential." Margaret smiled, feeling a surge of pride she hadn't experienced since her first student had passed the AP chemistry exam. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "We're just getting started." That night, as Margaret cleaned her rifle in the squad bay, she noticed that some of the other recruits were watching her with new interest. The whispers were still there, but they'd changed. Instead of mockery, she heard curiosity and something that might have been respect. "Hey, Grandma," called out Marcus Thompson, a cocky kid from Chicago who'd been one of her harshest critics. "How'd you learn to shoot like that?" Margaret looked up from her rifle. "I didn't learn to shoot. I learned to pay attention." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means shooting is just applied physics. Trajectory, wind resistance, muscle memory. It's not that different from any other skill if you approach it methodically." Marcus shook his head. "You're weird, old lady. But I guess you're not completely hopeless." Coming from him, it was practically a compliment. As the weeks progressed, Margaret's shooting continued to improve. She approached each range session like a science experiment, keeping detailed notes on her performance, analyzing what worked and what didn't, and making systematic adjustments. The other recruits began to notice that while they were struggling with the pressure and complexity of marksmanship training, Margaret was getting better every day. The drill instructors noticed too. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd made her life miserable for weeks, began to watch her range sessions with grudging interest. He still piled on the extra punishment, still called her Grandma with obvious disdain, but there was something different in his attention now. "You're not completely worthless," he told her after a particularly good shooting session. "But don't let it go to your head. One skill doesn't make you a Marine." Margaret just nodded and continued cleaning her rifle. She was learning to pick her battles, to save her energy for the things that mattered. And increasingly, what mattered was proving that she belonged here, not just to the drill instructors or the other recruits, but to herself. The physical training was getting easier too. Her body had adapted to the constant stress, the early mornings, the endless PT sessions. She wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest recruit, but she was consistent, and she never quit. The extra punishment that had once left her gasping and shaking now felt manageable, almost routine. More importantly, she was beginning to understand what Jake had tried to tell her. The Marines weren't just about physical fitness or military skills. They were about transformation, about breaking down everything you thought you knew about yourself and rebuilding it into something stronger, more disciplined, more capable than you'd ever imagined. Margaret was changing, and she could feel it in ways both subtle and profound. She stood straighter, moved with more purpose, spoke with more confidence. The uncertain middle-aged woman who'd walked onto the bus at the beginning of training was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, tougher, more sure of herself. But the real test was still to come. The range sessions had been practice, preparation for the qualification shoot that would determine whether she was truly capable of being a Marine. And as week 10 approached, Margaret knew that everything she'd worked for, everything she'd endured, would come down to her performance on that final test. The night before qualification day, she lay in her rack staring at the ceiling, listening to the nervous whispers of her fellow recruits. Some of them were confident, sure of their abilities. Others were terrified, knowing that failure meant starting over or going home. All of them were aware that tomorrow would define the rest of their time at Parris Island. Margaret thought about Jake, probably sitting in his garage back in Portland, working on his motorcycle and wondering if his crazy mother was still alive. She thought about the students she'd left behind, the classroom that someone else was now teaching in, the life she'd walked away from to be here. Most of all, she thought about the target she'd face tomorrow, and the decades of teaching that had prepared her for this moment in ways she'd never expected. If she could handle a classroom full of teenagers, if she could break down complex scientific concepts into understandable pieces, if she could maintain her composure under pressure from parents and administrators and school board members, then maybe, just maybe, she could handle this too. Tomorrow, she would find out if the woman they called Grandma had what it took to be a Marine. The alarm sounded at 0500 hours, just like every other morning for the past 10 weeks, but today felt different. Margaret's eyes snapped open before the harsh buzzer finished its first note, her body automatically responding to the routine that had become second nature. Around her, 41 other recruits stirred in their racks, but the usual morning chatter was absent. Today was qualification day. Margaret swung her legs over the side of her bunk and began the ritual of preparing for what could be the most important day of her life at Parris Island. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, making her bed with the precision that had become automatic, her fingers ensuring every corner was perfect, every wrinkle eliminated. The woman who had once struggled to fold fitted sheets now created bed displays that could pass the most rigorous inspection. "Rise and shine, maggots." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice boomed through the squad bay, though his usual venom seemed muted this morning. Even the drill instructors knew what today meant. Today you find out if you're worthy of calling yourselves Marines or if you're just another batch of failures who wasted 13 weeks of my time. The mess hall was unusually quiet during breakfast. Recruits who normally joked and complained about the food sat in contemplative silence, mechanically eating their portions while staring at nothing. Margaret noticed that even Marcus Thompson, the cocky kid from Chicago who usually had something to say about everything, was picking at his scrambled eggs without his usual commentary. "You nervous, Grandma?" whispered Billy Patterson, sliding his tray next to hers at their assigned table. Margaret considered the question honestly. "Focused," she replied. "I've been preparing for this my whole life without knowing it." "How do you figure that?" "Every chemistry exam I ever gave, every parent conference where I had to defend my teaching methods, every time I had to prove I belonged in a room full of people who thought I was too old, too soft, or too female to be there. Margaret took a deliberate bite of her toast. "This is just another test." Billy shook his head admiringly. "I wish I had your confidence." "It's not confidence," Margaret corrected. "It's inexperience. I've learned that the only way to silence doubt is with performance." The morning briefing took place in the same classroom where they'd spent countless hours learning Marine Corps history, military law, and weapon safety. Today, however, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Staff. Sergeant Williams stood at the front, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced by the gravity of the moment. "Today's qualification shoot will determine whether you earn the right to call yourself a Marine," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You'll fire from 4 different positions at targets ranging from 200 to 500 yards. You need to score at least 190 out of 250 possible points to qualify as a marksman. 210 for sharpshooter, 220 for expert." Margaret felt a flutter in her stomach. She'd been consistently scoring in the 200s during practice, but today would be different. Today, there would be pressure, distractions, and the weight of 13 weeks of training hanging over every shot. "Some of you have been shooting since you were children," Williams continued. "Others picked up a rifle for the first time 10 weeks ago. Today, none of that matters. What matters is what you've learned, how well you've prepared, and whether you can perform when it counts." His eyes swept the room, lingering for a moment on Margaret. She met his gaze steadily, neither seeking reassurance nor showing fear. "Remember everything you've been taught. Control your breathing. Focus on your sight picture. Squeeze the trigger straight back. Follow through on every shot." Williams paused, letting the silence stretch. "And trust your training." The bus ride to the rifle range was longer than usual, or perhaps it just felt that way. Margaret sat next to David Kim, the college graduate from California who'd questioned her motivations weeks earlier. He'd become something of an ally since then, one of the few recruits who seemed to genuinely respect her presence rather than simply tolerating it. "My dad was in Vietnam," David said quietly, staring out the window at the South Carolina landscape rolling by. "He used to tell me stories about guys who froze up when it mattered, even after months of training. Said the difference between success and failure was all in your head. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." David's voice carried a note of loss. "He died when I was 16. Cancer. I always wondered if I'd have what it takes to follow in his footsteps." Margaret turned to look at him, seeing past the young man's bravado to the uncertainty beneath. "You'll do fine. You've got good instincts and steady hands." "How can you tell?" 25 years of teaching teenagers. "You learn to read people, to see who's going to crack under pressure and who's going to surprise you." Margaret smiled. "You're going to surprise yourself today." The rifle range stretched out before them like a proving ground of dreams and nightmares. Targets stood at precise intervals, their bullseyes looking impossibly small from the firing line. The morning sun cast long shadows across the range, and a light breeze stirred the flags that would indicate wind direction and speed. Margaret shouldered her rifle and checked her equipment one final time. The M16A4 had become an extension of her body over the past weeks, its weight and balance as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd named it Patience, a private joke about the virtue that had gotten her through decades of teaching and was now carrying her through the most challenging experience of her life. First relay, move to the firing line. Staff Sergeant Williams's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Margaret wasn't in the first group, which gave her time to watch and learn. She observed the wind patterns, noting how the flags moved and how the early shooters were compensating for the breeze. She watched their positions, their breathing patterns, the way they settled into their shooting stance. Every detail was data, every observation a potential advantage. The first shots echoed across the range like thunder. Margaret could see the impact of bullets on the distant targets, some finding their mark, others scattered wide. She heard the range safety officers calling out scores, the satisfaction in their voices when someone performed well, the disappointment when they didn't. Recruit Patterson, 167, needs to requalify. Margaret's heart sank for Billy. He'd been struggling with his shooting for weeks, and the pressure had clearly gotten to him. She caught his eye as he walked back from the firing line, his face a mask of disappointment. She gave him a small nod of encouragement, hoping he'd get another chance. Recruit Thompson, 195, qualified marksman. Marcus Thompson strutted back from the line with his usual swagger, but Margaret noticed the relief in his eyes. He'd barely made the minimum score, despite all his bragging about his hunting experience back in Chicago. Second relay, move 2. The firing line. Margaret's group included David Kim, a quiet recruit named Jennifer Walsh from Montana, and several others she'd trained alongside for the past 10 weeks. They moved to their assigned positions with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and precise. The 200-yard line was first. Margaret settled into the prone position, her body automatically finding the angles and tensions that had become second nature. She could feel her heartbeat, steady and strong, and began the breathing exercises that would slow it down. The target seemed to shimmer in the morning heat, but the bullseye was clear and distinct. Ready on the right, ready on the left, ready on the firing line. The range fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the flags. Margaret nestled her cheek against the stock, aligned her sights, and found her natural respiratory pause. The world narrowed to the space between her eye and the target, everything else fading away. The first shot surprised her with its clarity. She'd been so focused on the mechanics that she almost forgot to notice the recoil. Through her scope, she could see the bullet hole appear in the 9 ring, just slightly left of center. A good start, but not perfect. She made a small adjustment and fired again. This time, the bullet found the 10 ring dead center. The third shot was another 10. The fourth was a 9, but well placed. By the time she'd fired her 10 shots from the 200-yard line, Margaret had posted a score of 96 out of 100 possible. Points. Outstanding shooting, Recruit Chen, the range safety officer noted as he recorded her score. Keep it up. Margaret felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, but forced herself to remain focused. The 200-yard line was just the beginning. The real challenge would come at the longer distances, where wind and elevation would play a bigger role. The 300-yard line required a different position, sitting with her rifle supported by a sling. Margaret had practiced this position hundreds of times, but it still felt less natural than prone. She took extra time to settle in, adjusting her position until everything felt right. The targets at 300 yards looked significantly smaller, the bullseye reduced to a black dot that seemed to dance in the heat shimmer. Margaret controlled her breathing, focused on her sight picture, and began the methodical process of engaging each target. Her first shot was a solid 9. The second was a perfect 10. She fell into a rhythm, each shot building on the last, her confidence growing with every trigger pull. The hours of practice, the countless repetitions, the scientific approach she'd brought to learning marksmanship, it all came together in a symphony of precision. When the smoke cleared, Margaret had scored 94 out of 100 points at 300 yards. Combined with her 200-yard score, she was sitting at 190 points with 2 distances remaining. She'd already qualified as a marksman, but she wasn't finished yet. The 400-yard line was where many recruits began to struggle. The target was significantly smaller, and the effects of wind and elevation became more pronounced. Margaret studied the flags carefully, noting how the breeze was shifting from left to right in a gentle but consistent pattern. She adjusted her position and her scope, accounting for the wind and the bullet drop at the extended range. The kneeling position required more muscle control than prone or sitting, and she could feel the strain in her legs and back. But she'd built up the strength over weeks of training, and her body held steady, The first shot was a challenge. Margaret couldn't immediately see where it had hit, and doubt crept in for the first time all morning. Had she miscalculated the wind? Was her position off? She forced herself to remain calm, to trust her training and her preparation. The second shot felt better, more controlled. She could see through her scope that it had found the bullseye, and her confidence returned. She settled into her rhythm again, each shot deliberate and precise. By the time she'd finished the 400-yard line, Margaret had added another 92 points to her total. She was now at 282 points with one distance remaining, well into sharpshooter territory and climbing toward expert. The 500-yard line was the final test, and the most challenging. At this distance, the target looked like a postage stamp, and the slightest error in judgment or execution would be magnified dramatically. Margaret had never been particularly confident at 500 yards during practice, but something felt different today. She settled into the prone position one final time, her body automatically finding the proper angles and tensions. The morning sun had climbed higher, changing the light and the heat patterns on the range. She took extra time to study the wind flags, noting subtle changes in direction and speed. The first shot felt perfect from the moment she squeezed the trigger. She could see the bullet hole appear in the 10 ring, almost exactly in the center. The second shot was equally good. By the third shot, Margaret realized something extraordinary was happening. She was in what athletes call the zone, that mystical state where everything comes together perfectly, where training and instinct merge into something approaching art. Each shot felt inevitable. Each trigger pulled a natural conclusion of perfect preparation and execution. The range safety officer was watching her now, his experienced eye recognizing something special in progress. Other recruits had finished their strings and were gathering to watch as the 52-year-old woman they'd called Grandma methodically destroyed the 500-yard target. Shot after shot found the bullseye. Margaret's breathing was perfectly controlled, her sight picture crystal clear, her trigger finger moving with the precision of a surgeon. The rifle had become an extension of her will, responding to her intentions with mechanical perfection. When she fired her final shot, the range fell silent. Through her scope, Margaret could see all 10 bullet holes clustered in the center of the target, most of them touching the 10 ring. It was the kind of shooting that instructors used as examples, the kind of performance that separated the exceptional from the merely competent. Cease fire, cease fire. All weapons are safe. Margaret engaged her safety and rolled slightly to the side, finally allowing herself to acknowledge what had just happened. She'd fired a perfect 100 at 500 yards, bringing her total score to 382 out of 400 possible points. It wasn't just expert level. It was extraordinary by any standard. The range safety officer approached with obvious excitement. "Recruit Chun, I need to verify your target. If this score stands, you've just set a new record for this range." Margaret nodded, her heart racing for the first time all morning. Around her, other recruits were watching with expressions ranging from amazement to disbelief. Even Marcus Thompson, who'd never shown her anything but grudging respect, was staring at her with open-mouthed wonder. "Holy shit, Grandma," he whispered, then quickly looked around to make sure no drill instructors had heard his language. "That was incredible." The target verification took several minutes, with multiple range safety officers examining Margaret's scorecard and counting bullet holes. When they finally announced the official score, a cheer went up from the assembled recruits. "Recruit Chun, 382 out of 400. Expert marksman with a new range record." Margaret felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected. Not just pride in her performance, but something deeper, a sense of validation that went beyond marksmanship. She'd proven something to herself and to everyone who doubted her place here. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached as she was cleaning her rifle, his expression unreadable. Margaret braced herself for whatever comment he might make, but when he spoke, his voice carried a note she'd never heard before. Outstanding shooting. Recruit Chun. That's some of the finest marksmanship I've seen in 15 years of training Marines. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. Don't thank me yet. You still have 3 weeks of training left, and shooting is just one part of being a Marine. But his tone lacked its usual harshness. However, I will say this. Anyone who can shoot like that under pressure has my respect. As the bus carried them back to the barracks, Margaret found herself surrounded by recruits who wanted to know her secret. How had she learned to shoot so well? What was her technique? Could she teach them? There's no secret, she told them honestly. It's just applied science. Physics, mathematics, and the patience to practice until everything becomes automatic. But how did you stay so calm? Asked Jennifer Walsh, the quiet recruit from Montana. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle steady. Margaret thought about the question seriously. I've spent my entire adult life being tested. Every day in the classroom was a performance. Every parent conference was a negotiation. Every school board meeting was a battle. I learned long ago that the only way to deal with pressure is to prepare so thoroughly that you can perform automatically, even when you're nervous. So you were nervous? Terrified, Margaret admitted. But I've learned that being scared and being prepared aren't mutually exclusive. You can be both. That evening, word of Margaret's record-breaking performance spread throughout the training battalion. Recruits from other platoons sought her out, asking for advice and tips. Drill instructors who'd never spoken to her before nodded respectfully when they passed her in the corridors, but the most meaningful reaction came from an unexpected source. Margaret was writing a letter to Jake when Billy Patterson approached her bunk, his face still bearing the disappointment of his failed qualification. I heard about your score, he said quietly. Congratulations. Thank you, Billy. I heard you're getting another chance to qualify. Yeah, next week. He shifted uncomfortably. I was wondering, would you maybe help me? I know you said it's just applied science, but I could use all the help I can get. Margaret looked at this young man who'd been nothing but kind to her since the day they'd met on the bus. Of course. We'll start tomorrow during free time. Really? You'd do that? Billy, you were the first person here to treat me like a fellow recruit instead of a curiosity. It would be my honor to help you. As Billy walked away with a grateful smile, Margaret realized that her record-breaking performance had given her something more valuable than recognition or respect. It had given her the credibility to help others, to share what she'd learned not just about shooting, but about handling pressure, overcoming doubt, and finding strength in unexpected places. She thought about Jake, wondering what he would think when he heard about her achievement. Would he be proud? Surprised? Would it help him understand what she was trying to accomplish here? Margaret folded her letter and prepared for lights out, but sleep was elusive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities, to prove that the woman they'd called Grandma had earned her place among the Marines. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She'd come to Parris Island to understand her son's experience, to bridge the gap between civilian and warrior. Instead, she discovered something about herself that she'd never known existed, a capacity for excellence, under pressure that went far beyond anything she'd achieved in the classroom. The transformation was far from complete, but Margaret Chun was beginning to understand what it truly meant to be a Marine. And for the first time since arriving at Parris Island, she was beginning to believe that she actually belonged here. The news of Margaret's record-breaking performance reached beyond Parris Island faster than she'd anticipated. 3 days after qualification, she was called to the company office during what should have been evening chow. Captain Elizabeth Hayes, the company commander, sat behind her desk reviewing a thick folder that Margaret assumed contained her service record. Recruit Chun, take a seat. Captain Hayes was in her early 30s, A compact woman with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. I've been reading some interesting reports about your performance on the range. Yes, ma'am. A 382 out of 400. That's not just excellent for a recruit. That's excellent for anyone. I've had Marines with 20 years of service who couldn't shoot that well under pressure. Hayes leaned back in her chair. Tell me, did you have any prior shooting experience before enlisting? No, ma'am. The first time I held a rifle was here. At Parris Island. Interesting. Hayes made a note in the file. Your background shows you were a high school chemistry teacher for 25 years. How does teaching chemistry translate to exceptional marksmanship? Margaret considered the question carefully. Both require precision, patience, and systematic thinking, ma'am. In chemistry, if you don't follow procedures exactly, experiments fail. On the rifle range, if you don't control your variables, breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, shots miss the target. And you approach shooting like a science experiment? In a way, yes, ma'am. I kept detailed notes on what worked and what didn't, analyzed my performance after each session, and made systematic adjustments. I treated it like any other skill. That could be learned through methodical practice. Captain Hayes smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of in the Corps. I'm putting you in for the Distinguished Marksman program. If you maintain this level of performance through advanced training, you could end up teaching other Marines how to shoot. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm 52 years old. Wouldn't there be better candidates among the younger recruits? Age is irrelevant if you can perform. What matters is results, and your results speak for themselves. Hayes closed the folder. There's something else. I've received a request from the marksmanship unit at Quantico. They want to study your training methods, see if they can incorporate your systematic approach into their curriculum. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd come to Parris Island to understand her son's experience, never imagining she might contribute something valuable to the Marine Corps itself. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what they want from me. They want to understand how someone with no prior experience can achieve expert-level marksmanship in just 10 weeks. If they can figure out what made you successful, they might be able to help other recruits improve faster. Hayes leaned forward. This could be significant, Chen. The Marine Corps is always looking for better training methods. That evening, Margaret called Jake for the first time since arriving at Parris Island. The conversation she'd been both dreading and anticipating. For weeks finally couldn't be postponed. His voice sounded different when he answered, less hollow than she remembered, perhaps even slightly curious. Mom, is that really you? Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. Margaret clutched the phone tighter than necessary. I have some news. Please tell me you're not calling from a hospital. Despite everything, Margaret laughed. No hospitals. Jake, I set a marksmanship record. The highest score anyone's ever shot on this range. The silence stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the connection had been lost. Mom, what did you just say? I shot a 382 out of 400 on qualification day. Apparently, that's better than most Marines with decades of experience. That's impossible. You've never even held a gun before. I know it sounds crazy, but it happened. They want to study my training methods, maybe use them to help other Marines improve their shooting. Another long pause. When Jake spoke again, his voice carried an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Mom, do you have any idea what you just told me? A 382 is ... That's incredible. Some of the best shooters in my unit couldn't score that high. I had good instructors, and I worked hard. No, Mom, good instructors and hard work get you qualified. What you did ... That's talent. That's something special. Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks. Does this help you understand why I came here? Maybe. Jake's voice was quiet, thoughtful. I always thought you did it because you felt guilty about not understanding what I went through. But maybe you came here because you're tougher than either of us realized. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, the longest they'd talked since Jake's return from Afghanistan. He asked about training, about the other recruits, about whether she was planning to stay in the Marines after basic training. For the first time in months, he seemed genuinely interested in her answers. "Mom, can I ask you something? Anything. Are you happy there? I mean, really happy?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I'm proud of what I've accomplished. I feel useful in a way I haven't in years. And I think I'm finally beginning to understand what you meant when you said I wouldn't get it. And now you do get. I'm starting to. The Marine Corps isn't just about following orders or physical fitness. It's about discovering capabilities you didn't know you had, about being part of something bigger than yourself." Margaret paused. "But mostly, it's about proving to yourself that you're stronger than you thought possible." That's probably the best description of military service I've ever heard from someone who wasn't there. When Margaret hung up the phone, she felt lighter than she had in months. The conversation with Jake hadn't solved everything, but it had opened a door that had been closed since his return from deployment. The remaining weeks of basic training took on a different character. Margaret's record-breaking performance had fundamentally changed how others perceived her, but more importantly, it had changed how she perceived herself. The woman who'd once worried about fitting in among teenagers was now confident in her abilities and secure in her place. She began formally tutoring Billy Patterson and several other recruits who were struggling with marksmanship. Her approach was methodical and patient, breaking down the complex skill into manageable components and helping each recruit identify their specific areas for improvement. "The key is to stop thinking of shooting as some kind of mystical skill," she explained to a group of 6 recruits during one evening session. "It's applied physics. Every shot follows the laws of trajectory, wind resistance, and momentum. If you understand the science, you can predict and control the outcome." "But what about natural talent?" asked Jennifer Walsh, who'd been struggling to qualify despite weeks of practice. "Talent is just pattern recognition developed through practice. The more you shoot, the more patterns you recognize, the better you become at making unconscious adjustments." Margaret demonstrated the proper sight alignment on her unloaded rifle. What people call natural talent is usually just systematic practice combined with analytical thinking. Under Margaret's guidance, Billy Patterson finally qualified on his second attempt, scoring a respectable 201. Jennifer Walsh improved from a failing 165 to a solid 215. Even Marcus Thompson, who'd already qualified, asked for help improving his technique and managed to boost his score by 20 points. The drill instructors noticed the improvement in Margaret's students and began referring other struggling recruits to her impromptu tutoring sessions. What had started as helping a friend became an unofficial role as the platoon's marksmanship instructor. "You've got a gift for teaching," Staff Sergeant Williams observed after watching one of her sessions. "Ever think about making it official?" "What do you mean?" "The Corps always needs good instructors. Someone with your combination of technical knowledge and teaching experience could do a lot of good at a place like Quantico." Margaret had been thinking about her future beyond basic training, but she'd assumed her age would limit her options within the Marine Corps. The possibility of becoming an instructor appealed to her in ways she hadn't expected. Would that be possible, given my age and limited experience? Age doesn't matter if you can perform. And your experience isn't limited, it's just different. You've spent 25 years teaching complex subjects to reluctant students. That's exactly what military instruction is, except with higher stakes. The final week of basic training arrived with surprising swiftness. The crucible, A 54-hour field exercise designed to test everything they'd learned loomed ahead like a final examination. Margaret approached it with the same methodical preparation she'd brought to marksmanship, studying maps, reviewing procedures, and mentally rehearsing scenarios. "You nervous about the crucible?" David Kim asked as they prepared their gear for the exercise. "Focused," Margaret replied, echoing her response from qualification day. "It's just another test, and I've been taking tests my whole life. This one's a little different from a chemistry exam. Not as different as you might think. Both require preparation, staying calm under pressure, and applying knowledge systematically when it matters most." David shook his head with familiar admiration. "I swear, you could find a way to relate the Marine Corps to teaching calculus if someone asked you to." "Probably," Margaret admitted with a smile. "But that's because both are about helping people discover they're capable of more than they thought possible." The crucible began at 0200 hours, with a forced march carrying full packs and weapons. Margaret had worried about the physical demands, but weeks of conditioning had prepared her better than she'd realized. Her pace was steady if not spectacular, and she finished the march well within the time limits. The subsequent challenges, obstacle courses, combat scenarios, leadership exercises, tested different aspects of their training. Margaret found herself naturally falling into a supporting role, using her teaching background to help younger recruits understand complex instructions and maintain morale during difficult moments. During one particularly challenging exercise, involving tactical movement under simulated fire, she noticed that several recruits were becoming disoriented and panicking. Drawing on decades of classroom management experience, she began providing calm, clear guidance that helped the team maintain cohesion and complete their mission successfully. "Outstanding leadership, Recruit Chen," the evaluating instructor noted. "Natural ability to maintain unit cohesion under stress." By the final day of the crucible, Margaret realized that her journey at Paris Island had become about much more than understanding her son's experience. She'd discovered capabilities within herself that she'd never suspected, found purpose in ways she'd never imagined, and earned the respect of people who'd initially seen her as an oddity. Standing in formation for the closing ceremony, wearing the Marine Corps' emblem she'd earned through 13 weeks of the most challenging training of her life, Margaret felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off the bus at Paris Island. She was stronger, more confident, and more certain of her abilities than she'd ever been. But most importantly, she finally understood what Jake had been trying to tell her about the transformative power of military service. The Marine Corps hadn't just taught her skills, it had revealed who she truly was underneath the limitations she'd imposed on herself. As she prepared for graduation and whatever came next, Margaret knew that her real journey was just beginning. The woman they'd once called Grandma was now Recruit Chen, and soon she would be Marine Chun, ready to serve her country in ways she'd never dreamed possible. Graduation day at Paris Island dawned clear and bright, with families streaming through the gates to witness their loved one's transformation from civilian to Marine. Margaret stood in perfect formation with Platoon 3021, her dress blue uniform immaculate, the eagle, globe, and anchor gleaming on her collar. For the first time in 13 weeks, she allowed herself to scan the crowd of visitors, searching for a familiar face. Jake stood near the back of the assembly area, wearing his own dress blues, the ribbons on his chest telling the story of his service in Afghanistan. Margaret's breath caught when she spotted him. He'd driven 18 hours from Portland to be here, something she'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. The ceremony itself was a blur of speeches, presentations, and traditions older than most of the recruits receiving their titles. When Colonel Janet Morrison stepped to the podium to address the newly minted Marines, her words carried the weight of history and expectation. "Today, you become part of a brotherhood and sisterhood that spans centuries. You've proven you have what it takes to earn the title Marine, but earning it is just the beginning. Now you must live up to it." Margaret felt the words settle into her bones like a sacred oath. She thought about the classroom she'd left behind, the students who'd probably forgotten her by now, the safe suburban life that had once defined her existence. All of it seemed like someone else's story. Private Chun, front and center. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as her name echoed across the parade ground. She marched forward with crisp precision, her mind racing to understand why she was being singled out during the ceremony. Colonel Morrison smiled as Margaret approached. "Private Chun has achieved something extraordinary during her time here. Not only did she set a new marksmanship record for this installation, but she's also demonstrated the kind of leadership and teaching ability that exemplifies the best of the Marine Corps." The colonel lifted a distinctive medal from its presentation case. "Private Chun, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Marksman Badge, making you one of only 50 Marines currently holding this honor. Additionally, you're being assigned to the Marksmanship Training Unit at Quantico, where you'll help develop new training protocols for future Marines." As the colonel pinned the badge to Margaret's uniform, she felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her composure. This wasn't just recognition, it was validation that her unconventional path had led to something genuinely valuable. "Outstanding work, Marine," Colonel Morrison said quietly, her words meant for Margaret alone. "You've shown that excellence has no age limit. Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to serve." When the ceremony concluded and families rushed to embrace their newly graduated Marines, Margaret found herself swept up in Jake's arms for the first time since his return from deployment. He held her tightly, and she could feel the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. "Mom, I am so proud of you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe what you've accomplished here. I finally understand what you meant about the transformation," Margaret replied, stepping back to look at her son. "It's not just about the training or the skills. It's about discovering who you really are when everything familiar is stripped away." Jake nodded, his eyes bright with tears he was trying not to shed. "When I came back from Afghanistan, I felt like I was two different people, who I was before deployment and who I became over there. I couldn't figure out how to be both at the same time, and now I see that maybe the person I became wasn't a replacement for who I was before. Maybe it was just ... more, an expansion." Jake straightened his shoulders. "Seeing you go through this, watching you become more than you ever thought you could be, it helps me believe I can do the same." They walked together toward the parking area, past groups of families celebrating and taking pictures. Margaret marveled at how different everything looked now compared to 13 weeks ago when she'd first arrived. The buildings were the same, the parade ground unchanged, but her perspective had been completely transformed. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "Quantico?" "Apparently. I'll be helping to develop new marksmanship training programs." Margaret shook her head in amazement. 6 months ago, I was grading chemistry papers and worrying about retirement. Now, I'm going to teach Marines how to shoot. Are you scared? Margaret considered the question seriously. Not scared, exactly. But I'm aware that this is just the beginning. I've proven I can learn and adapt, but now I have to prove I can contribute something valuable to the Corps. You already have. That record you set isn't just about good shooting. It's about showing that unconventional approaches can work. The military needs people who think differently, who bring outside perspectives to old problems. As they reached Jake's car, Margaret noticed a group of her fellow graduates gathering nearby. Billy Patterson waved her over, his face beaming with pride and excitement. "Private Chun, we're all going to dinner to celebrate. You have to come." Margaret looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, Mom. Celebrate with your platoon. I'll meet you later." The dinner was at a local restaurant that clearly catered to celebrating Marines and their families. Margaret found herself at a table with Billy, David, Kim, Jennifer Walsh, and several others who'd become more than fellow recruits. They'd become friends forged in the crucible of shared experience. "I still can't believe you're going to Quantico," Jennifer said, raising her glass of water in a toast. "When we first met you on that bus, I thought you were crazy. Now I think you're a genius." "Not a genius," Margaret corrected. "Just someone who learned that age doesn't have to be a limitation if you're willing to work hard and think differently." "You changed how all of us think about what's possible," David added. "I used to think being older was automatically a disadvantage. You proved that experience and maturity can be assets if you know how to use them." Marcus Thompson, who'd initially been one of her harshest critics, leaned forward with surprising sincerity. "You know what I learned from watching you? That respect isn't about age or background, it's about performance. You earned everything. You got here." As the evening wound down and the group began to disperse, Margaret realized that these relationships represented something she'd never expected to find at Paris Island. She'd come seeking to understand her son's experience, but she'd also found a community of people who'd shared one of the most challenging experiences of their lives. Later that night, sitting in her hotel room with Jake, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd nervously entered the recruiting station 6 months ago felt like a stranger now, someone whose limitations had been self-imposed rather than real. "I have something for you," Jake said, pulling a small package from his duffel bag. "I've been carrying this around since my first deployment, waiting for the right moment to pass it on." Margaret unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a worn military challenge coin, the kind exchanged between Marines to show mutual respect and shared experience. "This was given to me by my platoon sergeant in Afghanistan," Jake explained. "He said it represented the bond between Marines who've been tested together. I want you to have it." Margaret turned the coin over in her hands, feeling the weight of its significance. "Jake, I can't take this. You earned it in combat. And you earned the right to carry it by proving that being a Marine isn't about where you've been, it's about who you choose to become." Jake's voice was steady and sure. "You're my Marine now, Mom, and I'm proud to serve alongside you." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she placed the challenge coin on the nightstand where she could see it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at Quantico, new opportunities to prove herself, new ways to serve the cause that had already given her so much. But tonight, she was simply Margaret Chun, United States Marine, a woman who'd discovered that the only real limitations are the ones we accept for ourselves. The journey that had begun with a desperate desire to understand her son had become something far greater, a complete transformation of how she saw herself and what she was capable of achieving. The woman they'd once called Grandma was ready for whatever came next. 6 months after graduation, Private Margaret Chun stood before a classroom of instructor candidates at Marine Corps Base Quantico, her distinguished marksman badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The 20 Marines seated before her ranged in age from 22 to 38, all experienced shooters who'd been selected to become the next generation of marksmanship instructors. "How many of you believe that natural talent is the most important factor in exceptional marksmanship?" Margaret asked, scanning the room. 15 hands went up immediately. A few others hesitated before joining them. "Interesting." Margaret moved to the whiteboard and wrote a single number, 382. "This was my qualification score at Paris Island. I fired my first shot ever from a military rifle at age 52. So tell me, was that natural talent or something else?" "Gunnery." Sergeant Williams, her former instructor who was now her colleague, smiled from the back of the room. He'd seen Margaret's teaching methods in action and knew where this was heading. "Ma'am, with respect, maybe you just had good instincts," suggested Sergeant Torres, a sniper instructor from Camp Pendleton. "Perhaps. Or maybe what we call instincts are actually the result of systematic thinking applied to a new problem." Margaret turned back to the board and began drawing a diagram. Before we dive into marksmanship theory, let me tell you about my first student. The story she told wasn't about shooting at all. It was about a chemistry student named Amanda Rodriguez who'd struggled with molecular structures until Margaret helped her see the patterns. How breaking down complex concepts into manageable pieces could transform confusion into understanding. How confidence built through small successes could lead to extraordinary achievements. The same principles that helped Amanda master chemistry helped me master marksmanship. And more importantly, they can help your students master it too. What followed was unlike any marksmanship instruction these Marines had ever experienced. Instead of focusing solely on technique, Margaret taught them how to identify learning barriers, how to adapt instruction to different learning styles, and how to build confidence systematically. Sergeant Chun, interrupted Staff Sergeant Murphy. A Marine with 12 years of experience. This is all interesting, but some people just can't shoot well no matter how you teach them. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I used to have students who said they couldn't do chemistry. Want to know what I discovered? Usually they were right. They couldn't do chemistry the way I was teaching it. But when I found a different approach that matched how their minds worked, suddenly they could. She pulled up a video on the projector showing a recruit struggling on the firing line, shaking hands, inconsistent breathing, shots scattered across the target. This Marine failed qualification twice using traditional instruction methods. Watch what happens when we approach it differently. The second video showed the same recruit, but this time Margaret was beside him, her voice calm and methodical, as she guided him through a modified technique she'd developed. Instead of the standard rapid-fire approach, she had him focus on one perfect shot at a time, building success incrementally. Qualified expert on his third attempt, Margaret announced. As the video showed the recruit's final target, minus 221 points. Not because he suddenly developed talent, but because we found the teaching method that worked for his learning style. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. These were instructors who'd been teaching the same way for years, convinced that their job was to weed out those who couldn't hack it rather than to ensure everyone succeeded. Ma'am, Sergeant Torres said slowly, are you saying we should change how we teach marksmanship? I'm saying we should expand how we teach it. Traditional methods work for some Marines. But there are others, maybe 20 or 30%, who could excel if we just approach their instruction differently. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret walked them through case studies of Marines who'd struggled under conventional instruction but thrived when taught using her modified techniques. She showed them data from Parris Island, where her methods had increased qualification rates by 15% among recruits who'd initially failed. The key isn't lowering standards, she emphasized. It's raising the number of Marines who can meet those standards by improving how we teach them. During the break, Gunnery Sergeant Williams approached Margaret with obvious pride. You know, when Captain Hayes first told me about your teaching assignment, I wasn't sure how it would work out. A brand new Marine teaching experienced instructors. Seemed like a hard sell. And now? Now I'm wondering why we never thought to bring in professional educators before. You're changing how these Marines think about instruction itself. That afternoon, Margaret received a message that surprised her more than any recognition she'd received since joining the Marines. It was from Dr. Sarah Morrison, her former principal in Portland. Margaret, I heard about your assignment through Jake. I wanted you to know that our chemistry scores have dropped significantly since you left. More importantly, I've been thinking about what you said about understanding your students' experiences. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to consult with our teachers about applying military training principles to education. We could use someone who understands both worlds. Margaret stared at the message for a long time, considering the irony. She'd left education to understand the military, and now she was being asked to bridge the two worlds she'd inhabited. That evening, she called Jake to tell him about the request. Their weekly conversations had become one of her greatest joys, a connection that felt deeper and more honest than anything they'd shared before his deployment. "You should do it," Jake said without hesitation. "Think about it, Mom. You've proven that educational principles can improve military training. Maybe military principles can improve education too. It would mean developing a whole new program, traveling back and forth to Portland, working with people who probably think, 'I've lost my mind.' Sounds familiar. Didn't you say something similar about joining the Marines?" Margaret laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from watching my mother take on the impossible and make it look routine." 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself back in Portland, standing in front of a group of high school teachers who were struggling with classroom management and student engagement. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now using Marine Corps' leadership principles to help educators solve problems she'd once faced herself. "How many of you have students you've written off as hopeless?" she asked the assembled teachers. Most hands went up, accompanied by rueful laughter. "I used to think the same way about some of my chemistry students. Then I learned something in the Marines that changed my perspective completely. There are no hopeless cases, only inappropriate training." Methods. What followed was a presentation unlike anything these teachers had ever experienced. Margaret taught them about building confidence through progressive challenges, about setting clear expectations and maintaining consistent standards, about the power of earning respect rather than demanding it. "The Marine Corps taught me that people are capable of far more than they believe possible," she explained. "But they have to be led to that discovery, not pushed into it." By the end of the day, several teachers were already discussing how they could implement her suggestions. The principal who'd once thought Margaret was having a midlife crisis was now asking her to design a comprehensive training program for the entire district. 6 months later, Margaret's dual life had found its rhythm. She spent half her time at Quantico, revolutionizing how the Marine Corps trained marksmanship instructors. The other half was devoted to developing educational programs that applied military leadership principles to civilian classrooms. Both roles challenged her in different ways, but both drew from the same well of experience she'd accumulated over 52 years of life. She was finally using everything she'd learned, not just her teaching skills or her military training, but the wisdom that came from taking massive risks and discovering that she was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. The woman who'd once been called Grandma by cocky recruits now commanded respect in 2 completely different worlds. But more importantly, she'd found her true calling, helping others discover their own hidden capabilities. Standing in her Quantico office one afternoon, looking at the letters and emails from teachers whose classrooms had been transformed and Marines whose shooting had dramatically improved, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to Parris Island to understand her son, but she'd discovered something far more valuable, that the only real limitations in life are the ones we accept for ourselves. Every challenge she'd faced, every moment of doubt, every person who'd told her she was too old or too inexperienced, had been an opportunity to prove them wrong. The transformation was complete, but the mission was just beginning. Margaret Chun, United States Marine and educator, was ready to help others discover what she'd learned the hard way, that it's never too late to become more than you ever thought possible. In the end, the woman they'd called Grandma had become something far more important, a bridge between worlds, a proof of concept that excellence has no expiration date, and a living reminder that the most extraordinary journeys often begin with the simplest decision to try. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.